Chapter 24 is A Crisis in Confidence, Watergate. We're finally here to talk about the big scandal. And again, if you guys have not watched Forrest Gump, you seriously need to, because I'm going to reference it, and you won't know what I'm talking about. But I was going to show you clips, but stinking YouTube, they're going to copyright me and say, you can't show that. So I'm like, okay, YouTube, I'm not going to show it. So, but you guys can look it up. Okay, so President Nixon, we've already spoken about this a little bit before. When he ran for president in 1968, he saw himself as the spokesperson for Middle Americans. And he called Middle Americans the silent majority. He said, you guys are the non-shouters, the non-demonstrators. You work in America's factories. You provide most of America's soldiers. You are the heart of America. And he said, I represent you. And he is going to, his whole presidency is a little bit confusing because some of the things he did, like today, they would be considered, oh, that's a super democratic policy. And then others would be, oh, that's super Republican. Like he was considered a moderate. But he called for new federalism. What this meant is he wanted revenue sharing with the states. Revenue sharing with the states essentially meant that the federal government wanted to give the states money and let them spend it for certain things as they saw fit. Because he said, well, the states and the local governments, they know how to better help you. And so the purpose of revenue sharing was basically to, fund state social programs. That's what they were going to do, and get the resources to the state and local governments. Because he said that Americans, they were tired of Lyndon Johnson's big government. Okay, he said that they wanted to scale back, and that was the problem with the Great Society. So he wanted to scale back the government, that's what he said, but at the same time he expanded the role of government because he created new federal agencies. So there's kind of where it's a conundrum because he did both. But on your worksheet, it will be that he said Americans were tired of big government. Okay, so one of the problems that Richard Nixon is going to have to deal with during the 1960s, actually it's more 1970s, is stagflation. This is when you have a stagnating economy, like the economy is not so great, it's kind of in a recession, but you have inflation at the same time. Okay, inflation is a rise in prices. Now, some of the causes for this stagflation, as we called it. First of all, deficit spending from the Vietnam War. War is expensive, it costs a lot of money, and that's going to put us into debt. That, coupled with foreign competition, there's a lot of our competitors, Japan, West Germany, other European nations, we're competing with them for, consumers to buy our goods. And also a lot of Americans actually lost their jobs to foreign countries because it was cheaper to, make goods in other countries, which is still a problem today. But probably the thing that consumers felt the most was the increase in the price of oil. The price of oil increased 400%. Okay, and here's the reason why. OPEC. OPEC is OPEC stands for Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And most of the OPEC countries are in the Middle East. Excuse me. I don't know about y'all, but this quarantine's got me staying up way too late watching Amazon Prime. I'm watching Vikings. It's a really good series right now. Anyhow, OPEC. So what's going on, and the reason why OPEC is important, OPEC is going to place an embargo on Israel's allies. At this time, in 1973, there was a war between Israel and several of its Arab neighbors. Okay, and the United States, we sided with Israel. So OPEC, which again is made up mostly of Middle Eastern countries, they say, hey, if you want to side with Israel, we'll just cut off your oil supply. And you might be like, well, we make our own oil. What's the big deal? But a third of our oil came from OPEC. when we don't get a third of our oil, that's going to cause our prices to skyrocket, which, as I said before, 400% in 1 year. So, for example, let's say gas prices were $1, okay? Then they're going to jump up to $4, okay? That's how big a deal this is. And so we start to see gas lines because there's a shortage of gasoline, but the gasoline is also very expensive. So you might have to wait in line for hours to get gasoline. And, you know, they might limit how much you can actually get. You guys should talk to your grandparents. Your parents might be too young. My parents remember it. But ask your grandparents and your parents, do you guys remember gas lines? Because it was a big deal. You couldn't just go and get gas, and it was very expensive. So one thing that Richard Nixon did to help fight this was he froze prices and wages for 90 days. Like, nobody could change or fluctuate prices. You had to pay your employees all the same amount. And it did help for a little bit. Things kind of increased a little bit, the economy did. But then the problem is it's a free economy. So as soon as you take those price freezes off, things are just going to spiral out of control. And that's what happened. The economy went into a tailspin after the freezing on prices was removed. Okay, so Nixon, after he narrowly won election in 1968, he has to run for re-election in 1972. And he is going to pursue what he called a Southern strategy. He is, you know, he's got these middle Americans, but now he's going to try to appeal to blue-collar workers in the South. Blue-collar workers are people who work with their hands, you know, 40-hour weeks. Maybe you're a mechanic, maybe you're a hairdresser, you know, just ordinary, average people. And he's going to try and appeal to them, okay? And what he's going to do with this Southern strategy, he's going to try and get these traditionally Democratic voters on his side. And the way that he did it is, there were 2 spots that came open for the Supreme Court while he was president. President appoints Supreme Court justices. So what he did, he actually tried to appoint 2 very conservative Supreme Court justices so that the South would be on his side. They didn't get confirmed. They didn't get put on the Supreme Court because they had supported segregation. But the Southerners are like, hey, you know, he's on our side, you know, he's supporting us, but Congress and the Senate, they weren't on board with it. So that was one of the ways he got people to vote for him. Also, he opposed busing. During this time period, we had forced busing, which was, we were trying to desegregate the schools. So what they did to try and make sure that schools had more diverse populations, they might have to put kids that live here on a bus and send them across town to what had traditionally been an all-black school so that we have more equal amounts of black and white students. And lots of people hated this. But Richard Nixon knew if he came out in opposition to forced busing, he would get Southerners' support. Okay, now, civil rights. Nixon, even though he did those things like these conservative justices who supported segregation, at the same time, he supported affirmative action. In 1969, the Philadelphia Plan, he got that into motion, and it required unions and contractors. They had to provide a timeline saying, hey, by this point, we're going to start hiring more minorities, more women, more people of color. And like I said, this was affirmative action. Affirmative action is super controversial, but because people say it's reverse discrimination. But what affirmative action did, it was a plan to help African Americans overcome past discrimination by giving them more opportunities in the educational and hiring practices and processes. Okay, so Nixon won re-election. He won 96% of the electoral vote. It was a landslide. He became the first president to ever sweep the first Republican president to ever sweep the entire South. It was pretty ridiculous how easily he won the 1972 election. But that victory is going to be short-lived. because we have the Watergate scandal. Okay, so June of 1972, this is the summer before the presidential election, there was a burglary of the Democratic headquarters, where the Democrats have all their information and everything. And it took place at the Watergate complex. The Watergate complex was like a hotel, business center, office place. And if you've watched Forrest Gump, you know that Forrest Gump is the one who turned the burglars in. Again, if you've never seen the movie, you don't know what I'm talking about, but there you have it. So anyhow, this didn't make big news at the time. It wasn't a big deal, but there was a burglary. As time went on, Nixon got reelected in the landslide. But by April of the next year, people are like, hey, this Watergate thing that happened, this burglary of the Democratic National Headquarters, there's links and there's belief that some of Nixon's top administration officials, they were involved in it. They knew about it. Well, Richard Nixon, he denies knowledge of the Watergate break-in, cover-up, whatever. He says, I didn't do anything with it. He famously comes out and says, I am not a crook, which it actually turned out that he kind of was. But in May of 1973, the Senate Watergate Committee was established, and they start to hold hearings to investigate, okay, was Richard Nixon involved in burglarizing the Democratic headquarters? Well, White House counsel, they claim that Nixon authorized a cover-up. And today, most historians say they don't think Nixon was involved in the burglary, but they're pretty sure he was involved in covering it up because it would have made him look bad. And one of the things about Richard Nixon, he was super paranoid. So one of the things that he did as president, he recorded all the conversations that took place in the Oval Office, secretly recorded them. Well, people found out about this eventually. And so in July of 1973, this investigative committee for the Senate, they're like, Nixon, hey, give us those tapes from your Oval Office meetings and we'll see if you knew anything about it or not. Well, Richard Nixon, he's like, dude, I'm not giving up my tapes. I'm not doing that. I'm the president. You can't tell me what to do. He claimed executive privilege. Executive privilege is it's the principle that the president has the right to keep certain information secret and private. Sometimes, for national security reasons. And he said, I can't hand over those tapes because that's going to violate my executive privilege. There's a lot of private, secret information that would come out that could hurt people, hurt our country, and so I'm not going to do that. Well, later that year, his vice president ends up having to resign, Spiro Agnew, from a completely different scandal, totally unrelated. So Nixon is going to have to appoint a new vice president because that's what the 25th Amendment says. So he chose a guy named Gerald Ford. We'll talk more about Gerald Ford later. But there's this conspiracy that Nixon knew he was going to, basically get kicked out of office. So he said, hey, Gerald Ford, I'll make you a deal. You can become vice president, so that means you're eventually going to become president when I get kicked out, if you pardon me for any crimes. Okay, so that's the conspiracy. But anyhow, like I said, according to the 25th Amendment. Then, July 1974, a year after the Senate says, Nixon, hand over the tapes, the Supreme Court says, hey, President Nixon, hand over the tapes. And Nixon's like, dadgummit, this is not a good situation, not good at all. And so he hands over the tapes, but oddly enough, parts of the tape are missing. And you can tell when you read the transcripts or listen to the tapes that the direction the conversation is going, he's about to incriminate himself. And then, bloop, it's just gone. Nixon said, my secretary accidentally erased part of the tapes. It was a mistake. Sorry. But there was enough information in the tapes without the deleted parts. He was going down. So in August of 1974, Richard Nixon is pretty sure that he is going to get impeached. Now, you guys know impeached does not mean kicked out of office. It means brought to trial for wrongdoing. The presidents who have been brought to trial for wrongdoing, Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump. And Richard Nixon actually wasn't impeached. It didn't get to that point because he knew if he got impeached in the trial, he would be convicted and kicked out of office. So Richard Nixon became the first and only president in our nation's history to resign the presidency. And at this point, we're going to see a huge distrust of the government. It was estimated that in the 1950s, about 80% of Americans trusted the U.S. government. By the time of the Watergate scandal, that number is down to about 30% of Americans trust the government. And one thing that's interesting, or if you ever do some more research about the Watergate scandal, there were two reporters from the Washington Post that uncovered most of this information, and they had a secret informant named Deep Throat, who 30 years later turned out to be a high-ranking FBI official. But it's an interesting case. Because of this, there was some legislation passed, the Federal Election Campaign Act in 1974. It's going to set a limit on campaign contributions, and it provided partial federal funding for presidential campaigns. It creates the Federal Election Commission to enforce these laws, but the big thing is it limits how much money you can give to a campaign.